with two themes was the organization of chaos of nature by man-will. In an age of enlightenment, it was the organization of the form over the matter, or within the form there is matter. The point of it being that I think the humanistic movement was freeing from the fear from the rulers, or even from certain religious rulers, to oblige humanity to undertake their own freedom and then organize their own rules. I think that is perhaps a bit far-fetched, that's my understanding, but that Haydn's early so-called First Viennese School organization of the two-theme sonata with two opposite character themes, the male and the female, the rambunctious or heroic, and then the singing and the lyrical, in the different key, relative minor, dominant, subdominant, and then in the recapitulation after the mix in the development where the couple is formed of the two opposite entities, becomes the unit in the major, or main rather, key, if it's major, where the second theme pledges allegiance to the first by being in the original key, and this way demonstrating a certain way to assimilate, organize, and pacify the opposites, like the characters of the themes, or to tame nature, organize it by gardens instead of forests, by quarries that become castles, that the shape, the stone, the architecture, the sculpture, all the arts are there, the will of man to organize nature, therefore to dominate nature, and perhaps to substitute itself to the governing powers of nature, religious or not. And I think that in that sense, Beethoven's desire not to be, and perhaps inability to be a court composer, like Haydn and so many, or church composer like Bach and so many, was also the beginning of humanism, the age of enlightenment. So he wrote many sonatas, of course, as we all know. But I think that this absolute music compared to the, let's say, thematical music, or possibly the program music, with the exception of Les Adieux, the farewell, which he really wrote as such, the Quasi una Fantasia for the Moonlight is obviously, as we know, not his own title, but in the sense of the program music of the three movements of the departure, absence, and return in Les Adieux, he was attempting already to go against the form, and he will develop that feeling of rambunctiousness to become the composer to write the two movement sonatas, and therefore break from the early received rule of the sonata form, which was adapted to so many quartets, trios, sonatas by the First Viennese School and forward. As a matter of fact, Chopin wrote all his sonatas in 4 movements and didn't need to reject the form. But I still believe that what unifies the interpretation of a first movement of a two-theme sonata form is the pulse. When you look at the score, it looks always divided in equal spaces of shaped amount of beats, bars, almost like prison bars, but in a way organized. And thankfully, when you hear it as a listener, not knowing music, you don't hear that compartmentation. It's more for practical reasons to subdivide it so you can count 3 or 4 beats at a time when you practice it, or follow it, or rehearse it if it's a group. But of course, they're either 12 beats or 16 beats or 32 beats of hyperphrases. And of course, you have the addition of the choice of the meter, like cut time or not, etc. But in the case of the Pathétique, he uses all kinds of effects, included the French overture dotted style introduction. And that is something which I think we should not play as such. I think we should play it more as a free cadenza, where it's punctuated by the major chords, not in tonality but in importance. In this case, minor, of course. C minor, big, like Schubert would write, or Beethoven start with the diminished 7th 505, and here he starts with 1, and Mozart starts also on the first degree with the first beat as well, but goes up, and Beethoven wants to use the opportunity of the fortepiano that gives him the capacity to do orchestral, or quasi for the day, orchestral type contrasts. Not only forte piano, fortissimo, pianissimo, but also sounds and silences. The silence is so intensely, almost violent, like as if it stabs you in the stomach. And then the throw of octave leap brings you to every time to another dissonance. And then the resolution is always at best kept soft or faded into the rest or the silence. But the dissonance stays for a long time, and then the resolution is short, and then the rest stays as if it's the continuation of the resolution and the build-up of the tension as the conductor will do a beat, and then the musicians will sound. And I would think that in that case the very short value of the 32nd should be considered equal in articulation to the long value, even if the decay is different obviously when it's a 32nd or a dotted half or double dotted half. And because it's so slow and subdivided, it becomes triple dotted, which is what I did earlier in the first example of exaggeration. It should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4. But there are these kind of scales that are like the chromatic scale at the end. One bringing the relative major, E flat major, are supposed to sound as if they're improvisatory, and so, but they are very marked in the subdivision of the bar. Again, it's a good thing that the sound of the music isn't visual. It is a translation of the details, since in reverse engineering, the composer imagines it before it's on the page, and the page is supposed to be the incarnation or the echo of his thought. And therefore, when people don't read his thought or her thought because it's unreadable or because they're dead most of the time, then we take from the echo of their thought, reverse engineering their thinking pattern and thinking, okay, we'll overdo not the 32nd, no, perhaps 64th, here not, here with rubato. So we start allowing ourselves freedoms within the charted indication of Beethoven, if you take it to subdivide it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 6, 2, 3, 4, 7, 2, 3, 8, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4. Yes, it makes it mechanically, so they say, metronomically correct, but musically it becomes alienating, because in fact it's the suggestion of the held sound that extended stay with the dot or the double dot creates more tension, which paradoxically with the decay of the piano sound as such compared to an orchestra string quartet with voice defeats the purpose. I cannot go without to be ridiculous, but I could do at least a vibrato, I could do a sustain of the sound which the piano cannot do. So by nature it's an imitation of overstate tension with a very short release in a symphonic or instrumental, non-percussive instrumental way suggested. And of course it's so tempting when it's so slow to overstate that in triple dots. But even if so, I think the short value, and it shouldn't be so short, should be equally articulated. Like speech with 2 syllables, I want to tell, or something with 2 words of single syllables, very short, almost like not singing or performing or beautiful sounding, but rather speaking in a recitativo way, just spitting out a fact, a revolt and a complaint, but why? And then another painful memories, and then another answer solve it until that is after the introduction, the first theme. Now, who says how fast the first theme should be? Since Mozart's metronome doesn't indicate the tempo for this. I think it is to do with the pulse of the left hand's fifth finger, which is so obvious in the Waldstein. He goes 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 4 3 sorry 4 1 2 3 4 4 1 2 3 2 3 4 4 1 2 3 1 2. In other words, 4 1 2 rather. It gives an impulse energy of the repeated notes. 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4. It has kind of different bowing of groupment of groups of 3 and 2s, even in the repeated notes, as if it's a scale. And here it would be more in the broken octaves, like timpani, but not so much thumb, not the wobbly. So that you can practice it holding the thumb and articulating the lifting of the fifth finger for the pulse, like a bloodstream pulse that is obsessive, but soft, almost as if stifled. The syncopation makes only sense because we heard the downbeat. It's not minor major. It's an appoggiatura. No, it's an accacciatura. D sharp E. Could have been before the beat. But it's on the beat, short, long. Major, half minor, the major third, 5 of 4 in minor, accacciatura to the major third, Beethoven is very keen at not being just in one mode, like all C major, all in minor. We have in any case the pulse, we have the chromaticism, the hint of major minor, and the syncopation in the right hand. But it's not constant either. It is only in the middle. But the first beat is downbeat. We start with the... Because of all these dotted rhythms and delayed resolutions of the quasi-improvisato recitato opening la French overture section that is sort of like extending the tension, then you have to release it and you have to go to the downbeat. As if the downbeat releases all the exposition and then at the same time launches the departure of the first theme, but not in the second half, not the third rather than half. And all this justified only by the pulse. Beethoven and repeated notes, it's not only pulse, it's a thematic material. It's an insistence of the human nature again over the facts of life. Imposes its will on the things of the organization of the chaos of nature, as I like to call it. And the length of sound has to beneficiate the dotted half, 2, 3, 1 if you count in 4. And the exchange of voice between the bass and the alto should not be louder, so you don't hear fake voicing that reduces it to one part when it's stem up, stem down. So practice the top part legato, the bottom part staccato, to differentiate the moment of imprint and of touch. Because the moment that you touch, that you divide the sound between more impulse in the fifth and less on the second, both straight from the knuckles. So you can control a slight voicing as if you highlight, but you still follow. And if you feel it's more in 4 than in 2, you can go down as far, I think, as compared to the more panther forward 1, 2. It's more a cut time tempo, and this is more 4/4. It might be in between, because the borderline for the conductor between the fast 4 and the slow or medium 2, it might be just at the borderline. Because when the second theme comes, which should be in all logic in major, since it's the relative major of C minor, we should be to contrast fully with the chromatic C minor, which is hard to say. Almost a redundancy, but okay, chromatic is most of the time not major or minor, it's just chromatic. But here it's more dramatic, so I would say perhaps a dramatic chromatic minor. That's kind of awkward. And in minor, we have a relative minor, but minor, so it's not relative, it's just a flat minor instead of flat major. But that's because of the switch of the hands between the right and the right, in the left and right side in dialogue with itself. The bassoon and the oboe. So the speed of shift and the quality of landing before the beat to play it on the note before you play it, to control it and play it soft, like in the finale. To go towards the downbeat, pa 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 pia pa pia pa pia. It's not enough. That's an upbeat theme, if anything. So it's possible to play the first theme in 2, which obliged to play if it's same pulse. Sonata form is this Western European culture desire of synthesis out of the complexity or the opposites, instead of just stating them in a suite like it used to be in dances before for the harpsichord or others. The idea of intellectually organizing an element of musical motif and it becoming perhaps symbolic for things that you would like to hint, suggest or not according to the thematical or treatment of the piece, or just absolute music. Nevertheless, you have to be able to shift it, and so if you have to go slower for the second theme, easily glide or slide chromatically up in the first, then in order to have unity out of these diversities of themes, which are characteristically to be opposed between moods that are there suggestive of, while they're being within the form shape and organized by a group of bars that are very in fact organized, 8, 16 and so forth. Well, then you have to accept to play drivenly, not too fast. First theme to correspond to exact tempo, but with its own mood of piano and close-up. Or the second theme, if all the tectonic plates don't correspond, you play too fast. You have to catch up back in the coda of the exposition. Pick up velocity in this 8th note rolls. It's possible, and most people do, because we indulge on stage compared to what we practice. It's no more metronome on, or we don't count independently as we should as a conductor to our players' fingers. And to obtain this capacity to play touches that are independent from our count, so we don't sync with our playing, nor do we staccato our playing because we count independently, like the conductor would do even if the musicians play legato. But of course there is a separation of action between the beater of the beat and the player of the phrase. And in this case we are the one, so that they don't, it's difficult, but it's important to practice. One, one, two, one, two. In practicing is that you end up by hearing more your count than you're playing. But when you become really a pianist and you play the piece, therefore you find the energy and the action, the industry of playing becoming the decisive factor of the tempo, because it's how you feel, how deep you go in the keys, how articulation-wise you shape the keyboard that responds to your sort of the action of the piano lifting keys respond to your depressing them. So you in fact gain an untold mechanical action with the instrument that is independent of the phrasing of the music or of the count. It's almost as if it's a cognitive memory that comes in the muscular memory just by reaction. It's like a tennis player would just answer a given ball at a given position in a given tension of the net until, or the racket, until he or she responds to it almost without even remembering how, just feeling it, sort of like it's a reptilian memory of the things, of the elements. So you just play reactive. It might be that you don't even think it's a syncopation. In your mind you might think it's the beat. This kind of thing, which in fact translates what we most of the think, unless we have an independent count constantly in our practicing that establish the syncopation against that pulse that we voice in order to practice or keep in mind when we play in public, but we think of it. Two. Ta, ta, ta. The whole point of the syncopation is displacement of the beat, but you have to have the awareness where that pulse beat is in order to know and feel and taste and savor the amount of delay that the syncopation creates, and therefore how you play with that tension with resolution under or above regarding if you're going to continue into the development of the phrase bridge forward and further than forward, but both. And this kind of energy of playing has to be the sort of dialogue with oneself, the mechanical knowledge of the practice, almost autopilot elements, which we do in the practice by just repeating. And then the count, which is the desire to organize it in a willful directive manner to make sure that, for the second theme I have to make sure I don't slow down, so anticipate my gesture. And here I want to be not rushing. So I can feel my beat, so my syncopation doesn't make me rush further. And in the second theme, the shifting doesn't make me slow down, or the grace note, which comes before the leap of the sixth for the expression of tenderness, to integrate it in the melodic line, or just quasi together. That it slows me down, so I have to compensate by jumping to immediately pick up the second beat, but without accenting it just because I landed on it, but by shifting first faster than the beat and being on the note before, since my left hand is occupied, and sort of create two hands out of my only hand while this is there. The pianists that we play with a gesture for the sort of visualization of the cognitive gesture, and therefore we do some kind of circle or semicircle and arched shifting. And because it's piano, we have to be careful not to land with the thumb loud, obviously. So we take more time to anticipate. Well, when we don't, then we delay, but if we anticipate, we're on time. not to have a fluctuation in the tempo because of the character difference between the two themes, I would say when you practice, teach, and yearn towards it, no. It should be the unification of the diversity within the form. It's sort of like, for me, the pulse should be the framework of the architectural organization of the sonata form. And then the diversity of the characteristics of the themes that conveys different moods should be within the equality of pulse. So you shouldn't sound just for the sake of it in the same tempo all alike. You should be diverse within the alike pulse in order to have the return to the recap, or the development, or the recap, return to the repeat of the exposition become smooth and not obliged to accelerate or decelerate and organize it so just to fit the pieces of the puzzle, because all of a sudden you digressed in another tempo. Of course, skillful musicians who have experience or having played pieces manage to know where are the sections by the sheer fact of having gone through the path so many times, where they tend to lose time, and they know that they have to take that curve with that speed and that this, because but when it's slippery, but when it's wet, and so on and so forth. So all kinds of aspects come to mind, except that you have to, in one part, play the notes and synthesize them by chords, like I think that helps with the memorization, because you know the chords but also know them in their progression. And so then when you play them, the speed of memory and trigger and connection of the cognitive gestures, as well as the ones that you organize on the spot with the unexpected, are in a quick rapport of reaction between the brain and the coordination with the hands, a bit like a juggler would do, and manage to make a slower or faster tempo of the juggling without to drop right away the whatever he's juggling, balls or whatever. My point being is that, of course, there is a lot of, for pianists, repetitivity, which brings us to a sort of like an animal memory of the gestures that we produce. And so sometimes we just observe our hands play, because it's overwhelming to count each eighth note, obviously. There comes a point where you want to voice hold or not, suggest it or not, hint it or not. In half notes, virtually with pedal or with folding fingers. They fill up harmonically the eighth notes. It's very, 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 very interesting, because in acoustics of the concert hall or the room where you are, dry or wet, pedaling, which sometimes is anyway in the mnemotechnical memory of the practice room, inevitably connected. So you cannot just say, I'm going to play less pedal, and all of a sudden I don't know how to play my hands, because my cognitive memory is related to all this organization between right foot, let's say, and the hands. So you cannot just per se just dissociate one than the other and just make it like it's the volume of a radio. It's a little bit more basses, little less tops, and you don't do that in your playing. It's all in one. It's an influx, and therefore, if you organize it, it's by the pulse and the count and articulation for the voice. And just throw it with pedal. So you can hear the two endings, pulse and phrase, every four eighth notes, or whatever. And it factually, if you hold them with finger, it's like 4, substitution to 5, 4, 5 to 4 in the right hand, 5, and then etc. You can hold them, and then all of a sudden you don't depend only on the pedal with the staccato fifth, but the held, so it becomes more organic. For instance, but it's very subjective. It's not an interpretation. It becomes more than a recomposition at that point, because it's written only in eighth notes, with escaped eighth notes on the top, which in the pedal of each harmony of 4 held together, 8 notes, becomes a melodic line. But you hear it like dum 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 rather than da 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 da. But you can organize yourself to start with that staccato, put some pedal with it, and at the end only hold it. Then you enhance the crescendo beyond the expectation, because it's also a crescendo in articulation, staccato, wet staccato, legato, within the progression of the chromatic ascension and descent, or it's not always totally chromatic, but or just all exactly the same. It's more organic blank, or which enhances the impression of crescendo, because you don't play only in energy drive for volume enhancement, but also in touch with, and so you have this kind of multidimensional element of crescendo, illusion of crescendo that comes from the three-dimensionality of the things. This becoming always soft, the feeling, and then progressively louder and longer. So it gives the impression that you're exponentially expanding this crescendo even more than only how it's written. And that is a very good dilemma for interpretation, between the honesty towards the text and the reality of the expression that is inevitably embedded in the score, in the sense of this symphonic, I would call it philharmonic almost, if it is, crescendo. And so do you follow that idea? I want to go beyond what the piano could give, let's say even less than the pianoforte of the time, even if the modern one already is more powerful in length and in energy of sound production? Or do you just consider it in the framework of Beethoven and say, okay, we are only in the first half of the 18th century, so of the exposition, you could play the left hand as a chorale with 6-5-4, 6-4-5. It's actually 2 in the first inversion. But that's indicated in the held notes. Or you can use this descent of ornamented, decorated rather, descent. Consider it as a melodic asset, and then play the left hand softer because it's only the harmonic fill up. Or the opposite. Enhance the organic whole notes or half notes of horns or whatever it is orchestrally, and therefore also organizing the cadence perfect one in a relative major from which we're going to depart, or to which we reach from C minor, or then therefore in that case the top part becomes so light and just feather light decoration like powder over the or sugar over the raspberries. Director's cut view of that section. If you want to be objective, a bit of both. If you want to be driven, if you want to be more formal, organized, a bit like an architect or teacher playing. Argue that all the elements are supposed to be brought in, and then the mix and the fusion of the elements that the composer wanted will operate its magic. And I'm not here to highlight more than one or the other. Who am I to think is more important than that, than the teacher, than the composer, than the edition, or the performer's other interpretation? So many things can come in mind between the integrity and the desire to do right, and the meaning to do right, and the meaning of the organization of these elements, between the pulse, the melody, the harmony, the pedal, the articulation, the phrasing, the direction, the drive, and the also overall inspiration, if that is not a lame word for the spontaneity that sometimes gauche things reveal the piece better than only organized, but they have to be in practicing organized choices in order to have rails on which to build one's construction of the mind, or because of the ears, through the heart, and not only mentally, but of course ultimately through the capacity of the fingers. And sometimes this articulation is not easy to play because 3, 4, 5 glues often compared to 1, 2, 3. So if it's going to sound, obviously we don't want to demonstrate it unless we practice. Each nucleus of each finger play and lift, and then lighten it up in an air legato, with a legato in one side. So groom it and toss it. And it takes an infinite amount of time to just shape, present this miscellaneous element, which is not thematic, it's not even formally essential. It's just an embellishment that flows very elegantly, and has to be that. Not more, not less. Of course, any less will sound not elegant, therefore there is no less than right. And it's easier to mask if you want to bring that more out for good or bad reasons. So it is true that the way you voice, highlight, organize, practice technically can, musically could, but should you, and what it means for the structure and the style and the organization of the soundscape in the shapes, but also in the ranges that Beethoven explores, plus the rests that are so pregnantly intense, especially when we have this development starting from G minor and its dominance. Of the diminished seventh, 7 of G minor, which E flat becoming D sharp is 7 of E minor. Like a twisted, subtle modulation. And you start the first theme in E minor. Sorry for that. And this is a dominant of G, and every time you drop chromatically in the bass, you find yourself in a dominant of F. In the 7th degree of C minor. And again at the dominant, and this time you have the opening ostinato with broken octaves, pulsed by the beat. With his dominant pedal, he has this brooding diminished sevenths with the conjuncturas, acconjuncturas, and all kinds of dissonances that are there meant to maintain the agitation of the guts, the soul, and then spike out. And even when he does the 5 of 5 on 7, he keeps his 5 with the 7. So this dissonance, it's already tough to hear in a clearer octave, let less either resonant with large waves of resonance bass. Which is clearer, the F sharp or diminished, but creating the tension of the dissonance of the major seventh, or minor ninth. And that is more spectacular because of, that's what I meant, the usage of the space. Brooding in the bottom and spiking in the high. Of course, you can choose to put the pedal to cover it all in this kind of brooding feeling. A magma of ununderstood value of anything. You just hear that something is blurry, and then the spikes come out, or you don't put pedal and only voice the bottom part of the second and first finger. And then this, like harmony, which it is, of the diminished seventh. So the bottom part is the legato, accacciatura, the appoggiatura, and here the harmony is almost held. And then very soft. Without pedal, you can hear the dominant ninth in pedal double, unresolved yet. So if you do it slowly, it's the very same cacciatura appoggiatura on dominant, which exists in one slice of a beat in 40th Symphony of Mozart. And here it's with this kind of combinations of different passing dissonances that resolve with delay are meant to produce a sense of pain and delayed resolution. And of course, it depends on the register. And not too light and too crystalline, and here it's the brooding, and here is the screaming of the thirds, and here reassuringly in the thirds down, and almost at best cynical, perhaps even almost ironic, but not the sense of translation of the human psyche being in turmoil. Spend one's life knowing how to organize this in terms of balance of hands, of space, of piano, of range, of pedal, of articulation. How to make it clear, but not too clear, so it's not a hospital floor. It has to be a little bit smeared in the different dissonances as he wanted it, or he heard it himself in his time. The fusion of elements. At the end of this, with the return to the first theme in the recap, just simply a scale couldn't be really pedaled because it's mostly just passing tones. The melodic, no, the harmonic minor with the augmented second to add to the sense of dramatic feeling, the pathétique, which means really the tragic and the aesthetically heroic. If it was the descending minor, it's just more accepting. When leading tone in the gap to the sixth colorizes it with a more dramatic feeling because of the harmonic minor choice. And then, of course, second time, the second theme in the recap, allegiance to the original key. And mode in C minor, and then the conclusion, the coda of the recap in C minor, the place where if you had lost time in the second theme for all the different reasons of technical aspects, you can catch up. Rather recap ending, he doesn't end. He goes back to be even more searching for this kind of post-Baroque symmetry or apparent symmetry, to go back to the introduction in part, where the chord was holding the extended tension and the 32nd was the release of the tension. In the recap, in the coda, I'm sorry to say recap again for a mistaken term. In the coda, he is waiting for a rest. And not from a chord. The loaded rest. Loaded with intensity, because you hear it like a drum in the ear, like in circus before some dangerous jump. Sort of a mental suggested rumbling of a timpani or something. And then these very soothing descending parallel chords, and just a snippet of the original first theme to finish with a decisiveness. This sonata's first movement allows for exaggerations in dynamics, in speed, and I don't mean tempo purposely because it's so enticing to go faster than fast, blurrier than blurry, sometimes in like here, louder than loud, in a sense of banged loud. The opening, striking as it is by obvious contrasts of dynamics and harmonies and rhythms, calls for the teacher and the student, but also for the practicer and then the artist who travels with the piece through life and tries to present it at its best understanding and feeling and capacity. It has to go all in the same way. Is to find the sense of balance, the sense of the right tone for it. Is this the right tone? Is this really mezzo piano? Am I going to go without to enhance the crescendo overly than only the music itself exponentially expanding it? In other words, do I as a performer feel the right and the call to legitimately or intuitively, sometimes inspiredly, and most likely, hopefully, sometimes spontaneously, but in an organized way. So it's a whole artifice, like it's the point of the whole art is to appear like art, but artificially, and then have some kind of perhaps moral to it or sense to it, like in a book or a novel or a theater play. And so all of a sudden we are questioned by the elements, what we think of it, what does it mean to us, what would we do if we were to be in that situation, if we were the hero of that play, or if we had this moral dilemma to be or not to be. And I think in many levels, from the most mundane, simple, how do I play it, to how do I hear it, or how do I think it, or how do I repeat it, or do I change it the second time. All these elements come down to how I can play it and practice it. Of course, I think counting loud voice, separate from the expression of the music, unifying the differences of the themes within the unity of pulse, which would organize the whole piece in an invisible or an invisible but always there suggested thin thread that holds the whole edifice, even if it's a ephemeral edifice that will only hold a few minutes of the performance. And sometimes we think, oh God, I just reached the right proportions. And sometimes, oh no, I just messed it up again. And it's either technical, but also sometimes before the gesture of, I like to say that any mistake is an ill-prepared gesture to play it right. That is true, but then sometimes the anticipation of the gesture has to come with the brain. And if sometimes one is stage fright ridden or something, and all of a sudden the blood doesn't irrigate enough the brain, we're like frozen, like deer in the lights. So many aspects of the situation come to mind that could ruin the performance, other than the lack of concentration itself. But sometimes, because of having practiced it a lot, the unexpected will bring something new to it, and all of a sudden, some section you never thought played well, all of a sudden reveals itself to you, like, oh, now I understand how to organize this mud compared to this screen, or this decision of equal without to have a hole, and how I play my thumb light and throw and not too flat, so in order to pass like a vertical finger. This kind of elements are what clouds our pianist's director, conductor's attitude, where he just beats the energy and they play. We have to be energetically beating the beat for us, and we play. Yeah, we are our conductors. Mozart in his sonata in C minor for K457, slow movement, middle section, writes, continues with his aria, in fact, as a genre for the slow movement. Quasi vegetativo. By C.P. Bach is fragmented, and again the same theme in G flat that follows a dramatic pattern reproduced by step and chromatically dropping. German 6 and dominant of C minor, and very, very, very delicately he returns to the A section. And here he's back in E flat. So the middle section of the C flat major slow movement of the C minor sonata is in A flat major, the subdominant key. With this exchange of voices ascending forth in canon or in imitation. So Beethoven writes, and Mozart, chooses to have the accompaniment in the middle as a walk, a pacing at human level, and sandwiched between two melodic lines which are quasi-equally importantly expressive in their melodic design. Based on ascending fourths and drops by steps, and left hand with a very expressive leap of the octave, which makes the two parts, outer parts, in a dialogue and inside a little hint of Alberti, just enough to harmonize the triads, but also to give a pacing of 16th notes that is soothing and calming. Mozart chooses the repeated note of the ostinato, and Beethoven the alternation of the Alberti simplified pattern. Beethoven could have chosen a melodic line in the melody, as he beautifully did, regardless if inspired by Mozart's or just serendipitously so. But the bass could have been just a harmonization and have only the roots and have, or walking bass, but to have becomes almost a second melodic line of equal meaningful importance. This is so meaningful, and this is what Beethoven is, beyond beautiful, which it is, beyond inspired, which it is meaningful. And the meaning is to put thought in everything, as well as thematical thought, or I was going to say grammatical thought. The synthesis, the synthesis of the syntax, how to display the elements in a way that is apparently so obvious and simple. Few dominants, secondary dominants, 5 of 2, 5, 1. And then when he has the two alternate sections, the first is in F minor, relative minor, more narrative aria. You could isolate the melodic line of the bass if you were to sort of thematize the suggested melodic pattern of the bass, but this time is not with stems indicated. Deceptive cadence 5-6. But no, he reserves it as an aria in the middle section, or one of the alternative sections. In the second alternative section, he introduces in the regular key, but in minor, in A flat, triplets. Beethoven repeated notes already, we know it's an obsession, and they are obsessive, and they are meant to be so played inside the escapement. So you hear and not any bite or consonant, regardless of being a chord or not. Should appear seemingly almost as a mere rhythmic development, going from the 16th notes by 2 to 3. So it's slightly faster, obviously, by a third, by every 8th note. But it shouldn't be hectic, it should be just seamless. This time, unlike in the opening where you have two similar singing parts in equal values, rhythmic speaking, he has a rather more comic character. But I wanted to insist on the importance of the exhaling of the sentence. It starts on a downbeat, and interrupts on the downbeat, but the left hand, bassoon or another instrument like cello, is done to drop, but the melodic line in the top rises to slightly drop, and then the right hand's melodic goes through what Schubert would do later a lot in his Moments Musicaux, in harmonic change into a all of a sudden inharmonically far away apparently tonality, of F flat major, which is flat 6 of A flat minor, well actually regular flats, regular 6, if it's a harmonic minor. which can go anywhere and linger in limbo in the most long possible way. So in the second section, obviously the left hand is not a complement to the right hand, it's a contradiction to the legato melodic line. And then when it returns in the recap, it's a recap with the triplets inside in major. Sure, and probably I'm wrong to imagine such an equivalence of importance in voicing, demonstration, dialogue, perhaps even fusion between the two parts outer ones. Perhaps he didn't want it to be so much. Rather one on the top and the other one softer. And these completely muted. That. Of course, as long as this pattern is not too loud, but not too soft either, because it has to be the indication of the motion. Without motion, there is no emotion in this movement. It will be static. When he plays a slow movement, he writes in the Appassionata, he uses that kind of idle situation, choral, chordal, both. He doesn't do choosing his mood is so important for him. And in this case, the pattern of it's the motion, the gentle continuous step, and the legatissimo of the melody with overstayed welcome of the notes. Legato by finger, colored by pedal. Ritenuto. I like to imagine that Beethoven himself chose this tonality. Well, he had the choice in the sonata in C minor. He could have had a slow movement on the dominant. Relative major, naturally. It would have been interesting if he considered it as a minor key slow movement. But you cannot be relative minor of C minor, you only can be relative major, which is why E flat. So that was a silly thought. In general, the silly thoughts come to mind every time I try to think outside of the box, how he could have, why should have, or not, and on. But the connection to the A-flat major section in the Mozart is so troubling, if not more, but not less, because of the very same key and same exact emplacement of the keyboard. It's not even here. It's really in the same spot that I had to mention this similitude without insinuating that he copied Mozart, because after all he might, and even if he did, so what? I don't think it's determining for lessering or bettering the quality of its amazing experience of playing this slow movement. And how he spreads the melodic line in the pre-romantic era of these run-on sentences where the syntax always brings you to another high after another high, and you always have to say and this and that and this enumeration of flowers and sentences and nature and things, and you feel like you don't have enough of the expression to express your emotion of the welcome gifts of nature. I think it's a lot to do with this kind of humanism, placing man in the middle of the nature, and therefore this return to the nature in the inspiration. I think that is part of it, as well as the organization in the ABA form or ABACA form, cyclical or rondo. Speaking of rondo, the finale, which is of course the ultra famous and then that ornament was so unnecessary. It belittled the syncopation on the dissonance. And the decisive ending on an upbeat, tam tam pum, not on the downbeat. And immediately 5 of 4, then 5 of relative major, E flat major. A lot into the syncopations, and then he starts triplets. Sorry for that. The fact is that when Beethoven writes a driven movement, he rarely stays in one single continuous pattern of 8 notes, let's say, versus quarter notes like Bach in an Invention, or Haydn. Haydn has stop and starts also. Yeah, he does so many. Yeah. Mozart more dramatically. Beethoven reaches that point only after turning in the B section. The cadenza scale with the fermata. But the last movement, sorry for this note, is absolutely not dramatic. I don't find it dramatic at all. I found it almost playful, amiable, cunning. It's almost in major. Silliness. Of course it's not in major, and it's really in minor, but it's not in minor of the dramatic nor dramatic nor chromatic, just gentle. And the thing is, grace notes are, who knows how to play them. I think they're together. This kind of playfulness, not accented. I would play them together, But the real note, the C in this case, compared to the D, which is the appoggiatura, but kissing together, biting together, as mordent means literally biting, morder. The sense of bite is very obvious. It gives kind of the zesty bite to the note. But it should be softer than the real note. And the real note, the bottom one, should prevail a nano value longer to illustrate the pattern of the neighboring tone. The real value of fa, sol, la, re, mi, fa, written in value, and then the little grace note group of 2 should be faster than the 2 of the rhythm. And because we're after Baroque, I would still say the grace note before the beat. Or if it is on the beat, the left hand should be nano delaying by a baby fermatina. Too much will be precious and unnatural, and on the beat would be almost inconsiderate. You feel like a squeeze. I don't have time to say them, but I would like to tell them. And in fact, what is the purpose of the grace notes before the A flat, after the passing tones already bring it rhythmically, is to delay it. It's purposely there. So by delaying it, it gives it a meaning. The diminished 7th, the 6th chord, German 6, 5 and 1, 6, 5, 1. So I think there should be a distinguished rhythmic pattern. Sometimes I hear students driven by the pattern to go and producing a double ornament instead of having 2 passing tones written and the ornament sort of embedded but softer inside the... I know it's not only a detail that perhaps doesn't need so much attention, though I think it does, really it does. Oh, really does it though. And I think the importance is to have the accompaniment pattern not too driven, to allow the melodic line to have length of sound. It's so important, the length of sound. The busyness of the left hand kills the length of sound, and you hear, which shouldn't be. It should be. I would say portato, non legato, from close up, and phrase with directions and line. But certainly not staccato. It has something petty. I think it should be just almost a legato that is not connected. And not counting too much on the pedal, because if you come too much on the pedal, then you harmonize the arpeggiation. So he would have written, or like in a Waldstein, of course not. Nor of it would overwhelm the importance of the melodic line, which again has to sustain itself to the long value of the long values and the length of sound. So I would say non-harmonized arpeggiations, non-wetted by the pedal, connected by the finger but not legato. And dynamically under, so that they allow the melody not to be forcefully loud, but still distinguishable, but just by a little. Let's observe the melodic line. He goes to the 6th, 4th chord and down, but in between he goes with little escaped note, the F and the E flat staccato or non-legato, as if it was originally a passing tone to go above. But it doesn't go up. It is expectation, yes but no. And each step should be a little bit less in the drop compared to the escaped, which should remain a little bit zesty staccato. Repeated note, grace notes, group of 2 notes, I was going to say no, poggiaturas, biting together or kissing together. The subphrasing is important, but it's not as important as the general group. Once you have it in mind as a group phrase, you have the direction of the line. And you have to keep it always in mind. You have to visualize the beautiful tossing of the melodic line, dropping and rising. It's only then that you phrase meaningfully. If not, you just recite politely or phonetically, oh yes, I will be very careful, staccato and then not, and staccato and legato, and 2 by 2, 2 slur, 2 staccato, and the grace notes. Yes, it's all and. You have to practice the detail, but you need to integrate it in a grand gesture. Once you found that energy, that synergy of the 2 parts with the left hand, and the energization in sort of nourishing each other between the 2 parts, you have to play the dynamic marking, which is not loud. The subito forte. Fortissimo, mezzo fortissimo. What is that but a run-on sentence? We just barely finished. I just have to extend my C minor by another subdominant and its dominant. Second middle section, or ABAC, so second alternative section after the ritornello. Without any rhythm of staccato, of 8th notes, of grace notes, of nothing, just bare bones, ascending 4th and descending 5th, a bit like or in the opening. He is obsessed with patterns and he manages to show them well. He'll actually work in the same A-flat key with patterns of ascending 4th. In the fugue of 110, which anyway Bach did in book 1 of A major. So I'm not going to again suggest that he stole it, because it's not even what I think. But I cannot not help connect dots between ascending 4th by step. But in the case of 110, it's in the same key as in the Pathétique. notice, and perhaps it's just serendipity again, but it's the same key, and that's the only thing which strikes me the most, that he uses some similar patterns, but of course he uses such an amazing simplicity of intervals that become, under his hand, motivic leitmotif with almost a dramatic meaning, almost like we call it the dropping of the third repeated note, like the destiny knocking on the door, or on the consciousness of ours. So he's the master of taking mundane facts and transforming them into a transformative leitmotif with obsessive repeated notes, if often not, but most. So he doesn't need a complex chromatic subject of a fugue like Bach. He'd rather stay in something very simple that is obsessively repeated, developed like a dog eating on the bone until it takes every possible piece of meat of it. He doesn't give up the pleasure to develop his themes and to repeat his melodic notes into a pattern that develops. He likes to work on the material. Beethoven, compared to Mozart, who just likes to display melodic notes in a beautiful way and just consider the development as some kind of a unimportant passage he's obliged to take. But he doesn't really develop, he just restates the melody in different keys and returns. But that's his choice, and Beethoven likes to play with the elements, almost like he play with dominoes, or we play with crossword puzzles. So ultra legatissimo. He doesn't do that. Itself. You could continue for another 10 minutes, but he interrupts. Aha! What does it remind us? First movement. Dominant pedal, and here, the same story. This time is just alternate our pages. Well, with our pages. Difficult to do longer on one single dominant seventh. Nothing but insistence that proves victorious at the end as a melodic repeated note, if I may say, melodic repeated note, leitmotif, obsessive. Perhaps there was a cadenza in his time. Sometimes I easily go overboard, and I would say that this kind of playfulness is purposely probably there. Well, modern editions wouldn't indicate what type of improvisations were in the day allowed, expected, or possibly feared. I'm not sure that all composers, Beethoven the first, would allow people just to flourish as they want, even if they had a training for it, since musicianship was the way you learned music rather than the skill of playing an instrument only or composing separately. Regardless, it brings the capacity of several of the composers, pianists or keyboardists of the day, to probably show different type of virtuosities. But Beethoven inscribes a lot in the notes, in the patterns. It's better for that scale. And so the last time in the Return of Ritornello, he has the theme in the left hand. And returns to the syncopation in the original key in major. I don't even understand very well if he meant to be more like a moment of liberated joy, the plenitude of being in C major after all this struggle of C minor. Could be. Or is it that it doesn't have the same meaning as for us in terms of the Picardy third in Bach ending, or here it's not an explosion of happiness. But still, longer time in C major. But that was it. Ascending fourths, but of course, German 6. That was a very Freudian Picardy slip. It's minor, sorry. Flat 6, well, in major, but in minor is regular 6 again. German 6. And the decisive ending with a scale. It's very amusing and light-hearted of mine. A few years ago I was invited to play Chopin's E minor concerto in Picardy with the Picardy Orchestra in the city of Amiens, north of France, which is the region of Picardy. And since the introduction finishes quite longly in the orchestra, when I enter, oops, that was bad. That's what it is. I had the humor at the rehearsal to play in major. And then I would finish in minor. And they were not amused at all, the conductor and the musicians. And I said, "But it's an homage to Picardy, the Picardy third. I played the opening in E major." Of course I wouldn't do that in a concert. And they looked at me like in disbelief, since they don't know what the Picardy third is in Picardy. Probably they don't know what the German 6 is in Germany. Or that Bach wrote Allemands, which means German in French. But perhaps he knew that. It's a funny fact. But the fact is that it was a humor that didn't work. Anyway, it was totally immature humor. Oh, the Pathétique by Beethoven. This last movement, regardless that it is in minor, I think leaves high-spirited, more than joyful, but perhaps fulfilled in a certain way. I really think that this early Beethoven, combining the heritage of Haydn, the operatic Italianate effects for Mozart, if not of Salieri himself, since he studied with him too. And then injecting his developmental ideology, so to say, of the repeated note or the repeated element, the elemental development that becomes thematic meaning, and ascending forth, a repeated third, or, yeah. What an amazing crossroads between the end of the Baroque and not yet the Romanticism, and what an accomplishment, and at the same time a destruction that is ahead of all what Haydn built. But I think Beethoven left us with this modernism in his point of view, which I think is so invigorating for us today. Even if we can marvel at Mozart's out of this world evident simplicity of the melodic line that is a gift of the gods. Beethoven is more the struggle of man, which probably makes us easier identify to him than to a Mozart aria. But the slow movement in the Pathétique brings us to certain heights, but I think it keeps us in human level rather than supernatural beauty that we only can look but we cannot participate. I think Beethoven invites us to participate to his development as a listener or as a performer. He invites us to his struggle, and we identify with that struggle even if we are at a much smaller level. And I think he's perhaps less intimidating than Mozart is. Though, yeah, what would we do without? Nothing. It would be just poor in heritage. Even if most of his clavier sonatas are written as string quartets, as a genre, is still the instrument for which he brought it. This percussive instrument for long values. And who's to know why he chose the tonality? We can compare it. Oh yes, the C minor is pathétique, not pathetic. Oh, it's terrible. False cognate. Characteristic for C minor in Beethoven. Symphony number 5 and 111 and all. But who knows? Perhaps there is no specific reason when you ask to know. Besides, the pitch was not determined at that time, so you had tunings that could have varied from more than a second, perhaps even a third of interval. So perhaps it was played in C minor and sounding in B flat like on the clarinet. Think of the colors of the keys, or major, but if we do the beginning, we have this sense of discerning colors, atmospheres, and determinations in the tonalities and the choice of today that more or less is fixed pitch for the tuning. But we inject in the eye of the beholder what we like to see in it. I still persist to think that as much as Mozart's and to a certain extent Haydn music is inspired and inspiring, Beethoven's is also food for thought on top of it, didactically almost in his writing, inviting us to dig with him and find that bone. I think that is very much of a discipline to study Beethoven piano sonatas, because as a pianist you learn how to carve every phrase, interrupt every chord, give the meaning of each rest, be organizing the whole space of the sound from before it's coming until its disappearance, and how it blossoms with what articulation and what. And you cannot just play somehow a little bit of that and be careless with this. You have to be disciplined, organized in the detail, and have an understanding for the meaning of the sentence. You have to say something to what you play. You have to speak more than sing, mean more than seduce. Of course you like the rounded sound for the slow movement that you can search for, and the more incisive intervals like triatones and staccati syncopations, and the impulsive ostinato. Yes, all these things are there, but it's to mean something, to say something. I think to think something, and just the energy of the thinking, the transmission of the energy of the thinking through the extension of the melodic line, where it leads you, what it means. Of course, some things are done to be more either comic effects, either operatically speaking, either just a dramatic effect with a contrast and a dotted rhythm and all this. But these are just the facts. It's like you can enumerate all these tools of the toolbox. That doesn't make you a mechanic that you can build a very smooth, cool car, even if you have the ingredients. So it's not the ingredients that are characteristic, is the way they interact with each other, and your responsibility between over-pedaling and under-articulating and overstaying in notes that are supposed to be carved so that they give more meaning to the rest that will rebound for the next melodic line, and will say a sentence that starts on an upbeat and you feel like you're being brought, tossed, moved, driven. There is so much stage almost directorship to do in the performance, in terms of the organization of the thought, and then organize in response from the choice of this articulation for this length of phrasing with these details of articulation, how you're going to choose the tempo which corresponds to your capacity of independence of fingers or evenness of fingers, and whatever the notes have to be carved and played, whichever. Of course Beethoven chooses the notes, but we have to organize them when we play them in the way he wrote and suggested, and sometimes leaves a little room for wiggle here and there if it's ornamental, decorative, real, or just suggested or hinted. And of course we want to be so precise, and that precision sometimes kills us from thinking outside of the box while being in the box. So it's difficult to do both at the same time, but that's what happens when you revisit the piece after first learning, second revisiting, and then you start seeing things with layers of importance, and you hierarchize the meaning of things, and you realize that this is the meaningful note I'm going to just aim towards, which will carve the phrase this way and toss me to go to the next. All these things teacher can suggest, spoon feed, highlight, organize, give examples, like I like to play often examples, or even give the example of how it's not written in order to appreciate more how it's written, or sort of like unleash the understanding and the appreciation of this apparently obviousness of the fact. After all, it's written and played in so many centuries and recorded, so it's not like discovering a new piece that nobody heard. How are we going to imagine it? Obviously we have the popular ear that influences us. We stay there and we have heard it by so many people, and one day it's given to us to play it. So we have still to go through the process of reading the score, not just playing by ear because it's famous. That's how we avoid things like playing grace note when it's a 16th note, because we will not play it by ear as we heard it from many exaggerations, but see it for ourselves. And how we introduce the grace notes compared to the real rhythm, and what is the meaning of their delay, in our opinion, compared to the placement of left hand. This is the things in between the notes that are not totally, purposely not totally decided by Beethoven. He leaves it there, even if he's so sometimes maniacally punctual about Where is the staccato, where is the sforzato, where is not, where is the articulation that wants to be starting an upbeat, and then others which are the downbeat, and so on. I really think that this is the main benefit of playing Beethoven sonatas, is that more than playing beautifully something that you accomplish yourself, like any piece after all, you want to do well, that's why you struggle and study and improve and feel good about yourself, because you can prove that it's an added value to the brute fact of the score, because after all the score doesn't play by itself. But to bring it to life and to understand it for yourself and revisit it after several times through several years until it becomes part of your life, your language, it becomes your piece, and you find better how to organize this. This is the meaning of playing Beethoven. Not play beautiful, yes, but not only. Play meaningful. Even if you can contradict others with the way you play it, or even with your own previous interpretation, but put a meaning in what you do. Don't just reproduce and practice and repeat and practice. And of course, some of the mechanical things we tend to think there should be an autopilot of the performance, and a cognitive memory, and in mnemotechnic memory between pedals, articulation and all. But that's not it. It's only ingredients. It's not the end by itself, to play clean and together and right and perfect and professional. That is a requirement, but is not the end by itself. It's through that expectation of ourselves, with a lot of with courage, to go over and again and over and again until we find how to control all the elements. And in fact, forget in order to give. Because if your head is too full of things, you won't let your heart speak. And it's not cheesy to mention that, it's true. That's what captures the essence of the message. Thank you.